Well, my guess is that most likely in nearly every church in our country today, people are preaching and praying about pretty much the same things. The two mass shootings that we endured last weekend, the violent obsessions and racial hatred motivating the shooters, and the violence that pervades our culture. At this point, from all the media reports, you know the stories too well, I imagine. But what stands out for me, at least, is the Dayton shooter's sick fascination with murder and killing police, as well as, of course, the El Paso shooter's horrifying white supremacy. It's just hard to fathom. I mean, that man traveled more than 10 hours simply to shoot Latinx people whom he saw as invaders in his United States. And of course, we find the murders appalling and sinful, but so are the shooter's points of view appalling and sinful. I mean, no one is more fully human than anyone else, which we affirmed last week in baptisms as we promised to respect the dignity of every human being. To deny the truth that every person is a child of God is to rebel against the God who created us all. Well, what are we supposed to do with this? And what are we supposed to do with these mass shootings and the scores that preceded them? And what are we supposed to do with the shootings and other acts of violence in our own community? Acts so common they barely seem newsworthy. As you have probably heard more than once in this past week, far more people die in one-on-one shootings than in incidents like Dayton or El Paso or our own shooting in the Power and Light District last weekend. In fact, in our very own metro area, 129 children of God have been killed just this year, most of them in parts of the city that many of us don't see much. We bemoan the statistics, but we barely even notice when the story of the next victim appears on the 10 o'clock news. The story of another person wonderfully and fearfully made, but cut down before he or she became whom God intended that divine child to be. Meanwhile, the church's lectionary gives us readings this morning that don't really seem related to violence and hatred at all. And maybe that's okay. I mean, instead of pointing us toward the problems, I think they point us toward responses. Specifically, they point us toward the example of Abraham. Now, in addition to being the common father of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, Abraham is remembered primarily as the paragon of faith. And by faith, I don't mean intellectual assent to some ideas about God. I mean radical trust in God and willingness to follow God's ways despite the evidence that life can give us. God actually first calls Abraham 3 chapters before the reading that we heard today, asking Abram, as he is known in this part of the story, to set out on a journey whose destination he can't see. God simply tells him to leave his homeland and go to a place that God will show him, promising to make of him a great nation, to bless him and make his name great. And astonishingly, Abram says, "Yes, I'll do that." Then once he and his household arrive in the land of Canaan, God adds to the promise, "To your offspring I will give this land. And later, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth." So Abram and his wife are in their 80s. Imagine they're thinking, offspring? Really? But after some adventuring against the local kings, Abram again hears the word of the Lord, which is what we heard this morning in our reading, with God again promising Abram great reward. But for the first time, Abram pushes back, asking, "Okay, what will you give me? For I continue childless." "I know you're there, Lord," Abram says, "and we've come this far together, and that's great, but help me out here." So again, God assures him of the impossible. God says, count the stars, if you're able to count them, so shall your descendants be. And again, Abram believes, and God reckons that trust to him as righteousness. Now, that does not mean Abram didn't keep doubting, because he did. In fact, only 2 verses after today's reading, Abram needs reassurance once more. But he ends up finding what the writer of Hebrews named the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Well, in the face of this week's news, we may well find ourselves right there with Abraham, and right there with the uncertain father in the gospel story who asks Jesus to heal his son if Jesus is able. I believe that desperate father said, "Help my unbelief." Us too, right? We believe in the way of love. We believe that the kingdom of love is God's desire and promise to us. Yet, week after week, we see violence explode. We want to trust, right? We believe, Lord, but help our unbelief. Well, you know, as Abraham's example shows, trust is a choice, and a deeply countercultural choice, too. You know, the world tells us that violence reigns supreme. The world tells us that our only option for response is to side with one point of view or another in the gun debate, and whoever yells loudest wins. The world tells us then that the only likely outcome is more of the same, the path of despair. Well, we are not people of despair. Despair is fear all dressed up with no place to go, and we are not people of fear. We trust in the way of love, for Jesus' perfect love casts out fear. Even amid recurrent violence and darkened hearts and unproductive debate, we are not called to despair. We are called to love faithfully, to pray, and to act. Of course, you know, we could pray and act in many different ways. But I believe, at least, that our society will be blessed if we reframe our responses to gun violence, seeing that less of an issue of politics and more as an issue affecting people. We would do well, I think, not simply to argue about policy, but to focus on the people harmed by gun violence. For if we reimagine some abstract culture of violence instead as an existential threat to real human beings, people with names and stories, well, then perhaps we can recast the debate from whose policy framework is right to which interventions actually bring healing for God's children. I mean, we take this perspective in business and medicine all the time. Don't follow doctrine, follow best practice. We have a promise from Jesus, that healing power of love. We have to trust in that. The power of love for actual people, which defeats hate for disembodied groups. And we have to trust that love finds a way to heal even in the darkness, if we love with purpose and intention. And this includes calling out that which is not love, a practice that I think really requires just a few simple, holy questions. Looking at anyone's assessment of a problem or any proposed intervention, ask first, where is love in this? How does this response foster people's dignity? How does this response bless people at risk? How does this response heal people who are broken? How does this response represent God's loving rule and reign? I mean, the Christ-like healing of our nation's deepest wounds, like gun violence, it does involve constitutional interpretation and legislative change. But it also asks us, as people of faith, to shine the light of love on real, live human beings through prayer and through action. And even at the very local level of St. Andrews, I think there are a couple of trusting steps that we can take, two outward and visible signs of the grace that always puts people first. So as you know, each Sunday, we offer the prayers of the people, commending all of our lives to God, the concerns of our hearts and our homes and our cities and our nation and our world. Well, in those prayers, when we intercede for people who've died, we will remember those who have died violently in our metro area that week, as well as the perpetrators of that violence. This begins today, actually, with Xavier Mendoza, who was murdered on Thursday, and Michael F. McLean and Kevin E. Waters, who were murdered on Tuesday, and two unknown men who were murdered on Monday and Friday. I think maybe this might help us turn our hearts a little more directly toward those whose stories risk becoming just more ugly noise to ignore on the evening news. And second, we're going to be conducting an experiment in speaking and listening lovingly about our society's hardest issues, while also learning to see each other fully as children of God. About 15 parishioners are bravely giving their time to this risky enterprise, parishioners from across the political and theological spectrum. They will gather monthly, knowing that they disagree on many things, but committed to learning and practicing the art of Christ-like disagreement. Dialogue that begins and ends in love, gathered around a lunch table one day and the Eucharistic table another. My hope and prayer is that through its joys and its stumbles, this group will help show us how to do this work so that we can replicate it and create more groups of people learning to practice holy and loving disagreement. And I hope you will keep this experiment in your prayers, because it has the potential to be a game changer. I believe we are called to pray and to live out love because in this moment, the stakes are high for our city and our nation. And, the stakes are high for each of us. I think if Jesus were here, and of course Jesus is here, he might refer us to that gospel reading we heard this morning. For we are called to be faithful servants of the kingdom of God, despite the world's messages of hate or futility or despair. We're called to set aside worldly attachments and affiliations, even though the voices around us say, strive for position and power. We are called to worry less about whether we're right, whether we win the argument, and to worry more about protecting and healing real people. We are called to be ready to serve as our Master serves, not just because the world is dying for it, which it is, but because our own future rewards depend on our present vigilance in following the way of love. The Master wants to bring us to the kingdom, and the time to act on that is now, because the moment that matters is now. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit, Jesus says. Blessed are the servants whom the Master finds alert when he comes, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. and it would be good if we were ready.